If you turn on your TV, you will often see prominent scientists making some very dogmatic claims about how supposedly we don't need a creator to explain our universe, and that supposedly the laws of physics can do it without a creator. But you know, if you look at the scientists who founded science, some of the greatest scientists of all times, many of them were Bible-believing Christians, and they would have strongly disagreed with these faces you see on television. They would have really disagreed. In fact, one of the most famous physicists of all time was James Clerk Maxwell. You see him in that picture on the left. And there's a funny story about James Clerk Maxwell when he was in college, and it was told by a fellow student named Carl Pearson, who also went on to become a famous statistician. And this is what he said in his recollection. He said, "The conversation turned on Darwinian evolution. I can't say how it came about, but I spoke disrespectfully of Noah's flood. Clerk Maxwell was instantly aroused to the highest pitch of anger, reproving me for want of faith in the Bible. I had no idea at the time that he had retained the rigid faith of his childhood and was, if possible, a firmer believer than Gladstone in the accuracy of Genesis." So there was a time when these really good scientists believed the Bible. And the Lord asked Job, he said, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." We ought to exercise a little humility here. Were scientists present at the creation of the universe? No, yet, okay? See, I do know a little bit of Russian because I saw Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, all right? So I know a little Russian, all right? But seriously, were scientists present at the creation? No, they weren't. Okay, the Lord was, however. And so this evening, what I want to do is, as the Apostle Paul said, let's cast down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And so I want to assure you that you don't need to be intimidated by these claims. And I want to walk through this, and one of the first points I want to make is about science fundamentals. Now, you can relax. There's really not any math in this talk, okay? I got a few equations, but they're just for show, okay? We need to think, it's real easy when you talk about physics and the laws of physics to get lost in the details and to get overwhelmed by these equations, but we need to step back and look at the big picture. What are the laws of physics anyway? Well, they're just descriptions. They're descriptions of how matter and energy behave. Now, those descriptions are written in mathematical terms, but that's all they are, descriptions. Well, how can descriptions of matter and energy create matter and energy? How can descriptions cause anything to happen? They can't. They can't, okay? So this idea that these laws of physics have power to make things happen just is not true. It doesn't even make sense. And how do we know that these laws are true? Well, we do observations. Do scientists, physicists just pull equations out of a hat? Well, some of them might, okay, but hopefully they're not doing that because you need a reason to think that the equations are correct. And the way we do that is with experiments and observation. Now, this is the reason we would make you do these lab experiments in high school and college. It wasn't just to torture you. The idea was that hopefully the experiment would work and you can see for yourself that these descriptions really do work, that we're not just making it up. But without observations and experiments to back it up, those equations are just unverified speculation. And so I want to drive home this point this evening. No observations, no science, okay? There has to be observations. Now, one really important rule in physics is conservation of energy, and you've probably heard of it. Energy can change forms from one to another, but it can't be created or destroyed. Well, one prominent atheistic physicist is Lawrence Krauss. He's a theoretical physicist, and he claims the universe could actually pop into nothing from physics. Well, has anybody ever seen that happen? Has anybody ever seen a universe pop into existence? Okay, that's not science. That's outside the domain of science. Again, no observations, no science. So what would a scientist need to do if he wanted to really make a true scientific argument that universes can pop into existence? Well, not much. He just need to step outside the universe. Okay, so we've got our little physicist here. You can tell he's a real scientist because he's wearing a white lab coat. Okay, but he's going to step outside our universe somehow, and he's looking around. Oh, look over here. He sees a universe pop into existence. Oh, there's another one. Another universe popped into existence. Another universe popped into existence. Okay, now, he can make these observations, and he can write a mathematical description of how these universes are popping into existence. Okay, now, of course, I'm not saying universes are actually popping into existence, but I'm saying if he wanted to make a true scientific argument for that, he would need to observe it. He would actually need to see it happening. Now, you can't step outside of our universe. Too bad. Okay, it's not science. It's not science. It's what we would call pseudoscience. What the Apostle Paul would call oppositions of science falsely so called. Not everything that is called science is really science. So that's the first point, science fundamentals. We need to remember what the laws of physics are. They're just descriptions. They're just descriptions of how matter and energy behave. They can't make anything happen. Another point here is that sometimes these scientists will withhold information from you to make the story they're telling seem better than it really is. Now, I'm sure you're aware that many people claim that our universe came from this Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. And sadly, there are many Christians who will try to tell you this is how God created the universe. Don't you believe it? The Big Bang's unbiblical. It contradicts Scripture in many ways. There's no hint of billions of years in the Bible. It's just not there. But the original Big Bang model had some serious problems. So they invoked something called inflation. They tacked it onto the Big Bang model to solve those problems. Now, I'm not talking about this kind of inflation right here that we're all struggling with because our government's been irresponsible. No, they're claiming the universe went through this enormous growth spurt and the universe just ballooned in size rapidly. And supposedly this helped solve some of these problems they were having. Now, first of all, there is no evidence for inflation. Now, there was big news in 2014 because they claimed they had evidence for inflation. They claimed they had found the smoking gun for the Big Bang, and it was literally front page news, but then they quickly got embarrassed because they realized they didn't have what they thought they did. But Big Bang proponents changed their story over time. They're now claiming that inflation caused the Big Bang. So this ballooning process that caused the universe to just become incredibly large. And they also claim that inflation was caused by something called a scalar field. You may have heard of electric fields and magnetic fields. This is not exactly the same thing, but it's the sort of kind of the same idea. And they've got, this is where they get the idea that there are many universes out there, the so-called multiverse. How many of you have heard about the multiverse? Yes. Now, some evolutionists think that a multiverse removes the need for a creator. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. They are badly in error on that point, and we're going to see why a little bit later. But with that background information, I want to give you an example of how sometimes they withhold information from you. There was really big news in 2012 where they discovered the Higgs boson, this fundamental particle that was really important to theoretical and particle physicists. And Michio Kaku wrote an article. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and it was entitled "The Spark That Caused the Big Bang." Now, if you read that headline, it's going to make you think that this Higgs boson is what caused the Big Bang. And he actually went on CNN. He was interviewed by Ashley Banfield, I've debated about whether to show you this video or not. I've decided against it because it's too painful. Okay, I decided to spare you that. But basically, he implied that the Higgs boson caused the Big Bang. Okay, now, and Ashley Banfield goes on. Well, this could disprove religion, and instead of bringing her back to reality, he just kind of eggs her on and makes all these crazy claims. In fact, he even talks about Elvis being alive in a parallel universe. I mean, it's really whacked out. Now, the problem here is the Big Bang people don't believe the Higgs boson caused the Big Bang. Nobody believes that. And yet, Michio Kaku gave everybody that impression. In fact, there was one particle physicist out there who has a blog, and he goes, "Why, Professor Kaku? Why? Why did you say that?" And he goes, "Unfortunately, what the CBS News article says about why the Higgs particle matters is completely wrong." Why? Because it's based on what Professor Kaku said about the Higgs particle, and what he said is wrong. Worse, he presumably knew that it was wrong. If he didn't, that's also pretty bad. It seems that Professor Kaku feels it necessary, in order to engage the imagination of the public, to make spectacular distortions of the physics behind the Higgs field and the Higgs particle, even to the point of suggesting the particle triggered the Big Bang. So it wasn't just me. There were other people calling him out on this. And again, this thing about Elvis in a parallel universe, that is just really, really out there. Another point is what I call abusing quantum mechanics. Okay, quantum mechanics is a field of study in physics where you're studying the behavior of subatomic particles, and Lawrence Krauss tries to argue that quantum mechanics could allow a universe to pop into existence, basically out of nothing. And he appeals to something that we call the energy-time uncertainty principle. Okay, I forgot. We do have this equation right here, okay, but we're not going to get too involved in it. Basically, okay, he's arguing that there's this interpretation of this principle that says you can have particles pop into existence momentarily, violating conservation of energy. Supposedly there's a loophole where particles can pop into existence. So the idea is that a particle has energy, delta E, and if delta T is really, really, really tiny, you can have that delta E pop up and pop into existence or out of existence. So he goes, well, why can't a universe pop into existence? Well, first of all, that's an outrageous extrapolation. Even if tiny particles can pop into existence, that doesn't mean an entire universe can too. And his interpretation of this energy-time uncertainty principle is very doubtful. Now, I'll admit, there are physics textbooks that claim this, that claim the uncertainty principle allows particles to pop into and out of existence, temporarily violating conservation of energy. And this is how Lawrence Krauss describes it in his book. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and then he goes on to describe it, implies that particles carrying ever more energy can appear spontaneously out of nothing as long as they disappear in ever shorter times. In principle, particles can carry almost infinite energy as long as they disappear in almost infinitesimally short times. The conservation of energy tells us that quantum systems can misbehave for only so long. Like embezzling stockbrokers, if the state that a system fluctuates into requires sneaking some energy from empty space, then the system has to return that energy in a time short enough so that no one measuring the system can detect it. Okay, well, this fellow right here is named David J. Griffiths, and he is a renowned physics educator. He's written 3 really highly regarded textbooks, and I've got all 3 of them. The one on the left, on his book on quantum mechanics, is the best book on quantum mechanics I've ever had. A lot of authors will finesse stuff about quantum mechanics because they don't understand it as well. But you can tell David Griffiths really knows his stuff because he addresses issues that a lot of people dodge. And he actually got the 1997 Robert A. Millikan Award for outstanding scholarly contributions to physics education. And this is what David Griffith says about quantum mechanics. Now, I will freely admit quantum mechanics was my worst subject in school. Okay, so if Jake Hebert says something about quantum mechanics, it probably doesn't mean a whole lot. But if David Griffith says something about it, it means something. And this is what he said. It is often said that the uncertainty principle means energy is not strictly conserved in quantum mechanics, that you're allowed to borrow energy delta E as long as you pay it back in a time delta T that's about a small constant divided by 2 delta E. The greater the violation, the briefer the period over which it can occur. Now, there are many legitimate readings of the energy-time uncertainty principle, but this is not one of them. Nowhere does quantum mechanics license violation of energy conservation. So this whole argument that Lawrence Krauss is making is bogus to begin with. I mean, there's a serious question as to whether or not this idea that particles can pop into existence, that's probably not correct, and his extrapolation is for sure not correct. And in his other book, David Griffiths went on to say this: in general, when you hear a physicist invoke the uncertainty principle, keep a hand on your wallet. Okay, so he's probably trying to pull a fast one on you, okay, all right? So there's a tendency for these guys to want to abuse quantum mechanics and argue that, oh yeah, you can have universes popping into existence, and it's really not true. Now, Lawrence Krauss made another statement that I want to respond to, kind of a smart alecky comment on page 144 of his book. He said, I have challenged several theologians to provide evidence contradicting the premise that theology has made no contribution to knowledge in the past 500 years at least, since the dawn of science. And then he says, well, nobody's taken me up on my challenge. So he's claiming theology hasn't done anybody any real good in 500 years. Well, I accept your challenge, Dr. Krauss, and I'll give you an example where theology made a big contribution to physics and our understanding of the physical world. James Joule was a brewer, and he played an extremely important role in figuring out that energy is conserved, that the total energy stays the same. In fact, a unit of energy is named after him in his honor. And he did this really important experiment where he showed that a certain amount of work resulted in a certain amount of heat being generated. Basically, one British thermal unit being produced by 772.55 foot-pounds of work. And if you look at his tombstone, you can see that that number is on the top, 772.55. Now, today, we don't really talk about those units as much. We now talk about calories and joules. So we see that a calorie is generated by 4.184 joules of work. Now, theology influenced his science. It really did. You see, at the time this was all going on, there were some people who thought energy could be destroyed. It wasn't necessarily conserved. But Joule said they're wrong, and he said it based on his belief in Scripture. He said, believing that the power to destroy belongs to the Creator alone, I affirm that any theory which, when carried out, demands the annihilation of force, today we would say energy, is necessarily erroneous. And guess what? He was right. And where would we be today if it weren't for James Joule? Where would physics be without conservation of energy? And he was influenced by his theology. And notice he's got a verse of Scripture at the top of his tombstone. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. And of course, down at the bottom it says, thy will be done. So what would James Joule think of guys like Lawrence Krauss claiming that universes can just pop into existence out of nothing? Well, probably not too much. And there's another point I want to make about this idea that quantum mechanics could create a universe. If you open a quantum quantum mechanics textbook. It just assumes that space and time already exist. Well, how then can quantum mechanics create space and time if they already exist, if they already exist in the theory? Well, they can't. That's just totally illogical. Again, sometimes we can be overwhelmed by the equations and we get lost in the weeds, but we just have to step back and look at the big picture. When you realize that these mathematical descriptions are just that, descriptions, then you realize, well, they can't really do anything. Also, a lot of these guys will commit some really outrageous logical fallacies. Stephen Hawking is a good example, the late Stephen Hawking. Now, he was a very, very smart man, but he said some things that were frankly nonsense. He said in his book, The Grand Design, because there is such a law as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. Well, that's just nonsense. How can the universe create itself? How can anything create itself? And his idea that gravity could create the universe, what is gravity? Gravity is an attraction between masses in a universe that already exists. How then does gravity create the universe? You can't have gravity unless the universe is already there. So this is total nonsense. And you're reminded of what the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 1. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Another thing they will often do is they will play around with their words. They will cheat on their definitions. If you read his book, he's claiming that a universe can come from nothing, but he really says, well, nothing isn't really nothing. It's something. And this is what you call the equivocation fallacy in logic. They do this all the time. Evolutionists do this a lot. For instance, they will say, you don't believe in evolution? Well, evolution just means change. You're not denying that change happens, are you? Well, that's a little disingenuous, because when they talk about evolution, they're not just talking about change. They're talking about a very special kind of change. They're talking about molecules turning into man over billions of years. That's not just change. That's a special kind of change. And then you say, well, nothing is really something. Well, if our universe came from something that already existed, then it really wasn't created from nothing, was it? This is just a disguised version of the claim that the universe is eternal. That's what the ancient pagans said. And I would have a lot more respect for these guys if they would just be honest and say, oh, we think the universe is eternal. Because something has to be eternal. It's either God or the universe. And I would again respect these guys a lot more if they would quit playing these games and just be honest about what they're really saying. So we got these logical fallacies. And if the universe is a cosmic accident, then why should it obey orderly laws? Why should math work so well at describing the universe? If you're an evolutionist, you don't have a good answer for that. But as Christians, we do. The universe is orderly because Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. The Bible tells us God is not the author of confusion. So those are some of the mistakes, I think, that people use when they try to argue that the laws of physics can create the universe. Now, some evolutionists think the multiverse removes the need for a creator. And I want to explicitly address this because this is a popular claim, and I want to show you why it's bogus. They will claim, now they will admit that it seems wildly improbable that we could be here as the result of a cosmic accident. They admit that. But they say, there could be other universes out there, maybe billions of other universes, and some of them would have laws of physics and chemistry that allow life to come from non-life. In some of these universes, maybe chemicals can turn into living things. And that's their argument. They say, well, maybe we live in one of those universes. Well, this is why they're wrong. First, there's no evidence that other universes exist. Now, some evolutionists will say, well, the Big Bang doesn't work without inflation, therefore inflation must be true. Well, that's not evidence, that's just a circular argument. And honestly, I think some scientists have probably been reading too many comic books, okay, or watching too many editions in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all right? So there's no evidence there's a multiverse. There isn't. But let's just suppose for the sake of argument that these other universes do exist. And let's be really generous to the evolutionists. Let's suppose, also for the sake of argument, the laws of physics and chemistry in every single one of these other universes allow life to come from non-life. They allow abiogenesis. They allow chemicals to turn into living things. So what? That does nothing to explain the origin of life in our universe. We're not talking about the origin of life in some other universe. We're talking about the origin of life in this universe, the one we actually live in. Whether or not other hypothetical universes exist is completely irrelevant. You see what they've done? It's rhetorical sleight of hand. They've diverted your attention from the real issue with these other hypothetical universes and got you off the real picture. The real issue is, do our laws of physics allow life to come from non-life? Well, apparently not, because if they did, why hasn't somebody done an experiment demonstrating that? Well, because our laws of physics don't allow that. Okay, they allow life to exist, but they don't allow life to come from non-life. And origin of life researchers don't have a clue as to how life began. And James Tour is a very respected chemist at Rice University, and he's literally said that. They don't have a clue. And he's really gone after these guys for bluffing about what they really know and don't know. And he's got some really good YouTube videos. So I hope this little talk has encouraged you. You don't need to be intimidated. These are bogus claims, and you'll notice there's a little acrostic here. I don't know if it works in Russian, but it works in English. You got law, the first letters spell out law, since we're talking about the laws of physics. They're making logical fallacies. They're abusing quantum mechanics. They're withholding important information to make the story they're telling seem stronger. And they're forgetting science fundamentals. So again, I hope this talk has been an encouragement to you. If you aren't signed up for our bi-monthly magazine, Acts and Facts, I hope that you will. It's our gift to you. It's paid for by our donors. And I want to briefly tell you about the other research that I'm working on. And honestly, the research that I'm working on right now is way more exciting than what we just talked about. Okay? I am finding evidence that's already been published in the mainstream scientific literature that fossils show that pre-flood animals had extremely long lifespans. Now, the reason I get real excited about that is because the Bible tells us people had really long lifespans before the flood. And if you really think about it, it makes sense that the animals would too, because pretty much any mechanism that you can think of to explain the human longevity, unless you believe it was supernatural, and the Bible really doesn't give any indication of that, there's every indication that for whatever reason, this was normal in the pre-flood world. There just seems to have been something about that world, about that environment that allowed this longevity. And if you think about it, if you think this is something that can potentially be explained scientifically, you're almost forced to conclude that the same would have been true for the animals. Because any mechanism you can come up with to explain the longevity of Adam and the early Genesis 5 patriarchs would also apply to the animals. I mean, think about it. Adam and Eve had no mistakes in their DNA. And their sons and daughters, they might have had a few mistakes in their DNA, but they didn't have too many. So they had almost perfect genomes and perfect bodies. Well, guess what? When God made the animals, the same thing was true of them as well. They didn't have any mistakes in their DNA either. And you might say, well, maybe it was the environment. Maybe the environment enabled Adam and Eve to live to be really old. Well, guess what? The animals are living in that same environment. And I'm finding evidence. I'm finding evidence in fossil birds, mammals, reptiles, oysters, and clams that they were living much, much longer than animals today. And I actually was able to give a talk to the Design Science Association of Portland yesterday, and it's on YouTube. Okay, if you'd like to watch it, it's free. It's about an hour long. It's pretty lengthy, but I'm really excited about this because this is one of the claims in the Bible people have the biggest problem with. How can somebody live to be 900 years old? And I'm not sure what the answer is exactly, but I am tickled pink. We're finding evidence it was happening. We're finding evidence that not only were the people living to be hundreds of years old, but some of the animals were too. So if you want to, you can go to the Design Science Northwest organization website, or you can go to YouTube and you can watch that video for free. So again, please, if you haven't signed up for our bi-monthly magazine, Acts and Facts, I hope that you will do so. And again, it's our gift to you. It's paid for by our donors. And I think we've got some time now. I'm going to hand it back over to your pastor, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The very first question I've got when I was listening to you, like we say that this science is so bogus.
Yeah, it is.
There's so many things that they're just trying to extrapolate and just like add things and just change and everything.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, why so many people actually fall off to that? And not just so many people, but why so many Christians actually do follow that? They follow this Big Bang theory or evolution, creation theory, whatever theory they can think of. Like, why is that happening? What do you think?
Well, I think for unbelievers, they just don't want to admit they're going to have to give an account to the Lord. I think for them that's it. For the Christians, I think some of it's we're not very discerning. We tend to be a little bit gullible. We tend to, because we try to be honest in our own dealings, we have a hard time imagining that maybe the scientists might, in some cases, be pulling a fast one on us. And so, we need to, as Paul said, we don't want to be tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine, but by cunningness and deceitfulness of men. And, we need to realize that a lot of these times these guys have an agenda. They really do. Yeah.
Oh, that's true. That's true. That's why actually we do receive your bi-monthly magazines.
Okay.
I think this is a really good thing. Just if you want to even like know and just follow what's happening, because there's so many other posts and like claims that this is scientifically proven and so on. Well, another question I would have about so-called science is global warming.
Okay. It's a hot topic.
It's a hot topic.
Right, yeah.
I know. That's the thing, because that one you say like, okay, if they claim like hold on to your pocket or like your wallet,
right?
Because yes, most likely that's something happened. So especially since you did your research in like it says like research on the connection between cosmic rays, solar activity, and weather and climate. Well, can you tell us a little bit more about that? I know it might be like a little bit too technical for the people out here, but also, what do you think about global warming and how it can affect our planet if it's real? Because again, in one of your talks, you said like about that Milankovitch theory. And how that affects our
there's a lot we could say on this.
Okay.
When I believe the Lord, by His grace, had me end up working for my Ph.D. advisor, who really was onto some cutting-edge research. And I didn't know what I was doing when I got in with him. I just, I didn't want to go north to school because it was too cold, so I wanted to stay south. And I wanted to stay in Texas because there was in-state tuition, so I kind of narrowed it down. I just ended up going to UT Dallas. But people for a long time have thought there may be a connection between the sun and the weather. And at first glance, you think, well, of course there is. But on another level, it seems like there wouldn't be, because the energy from the sun is very constant. It doesn't change very much. So what you might wonder, well, how, in order for the sun to affect the weather, something has to be changing. But there is something about the sun that changes a lot, and that's the magnetic field. Okay. And when that changes, that affects how many cosmic rays enter the atmosphere. And people have speculated for a long time there's a connection between that and weather and climate. Now, there's another guy out there, he's a Danish physicist named Henrik Svensmark, and he gets a lot of publicity. He gets all this publicity, and basically he just says when you get more cosmic rays coming in from outer space, you get more clouds. Okay, and that's really too simplistic. And my advisor had a different idea about it, and I want to make clear he's not a Christian, he's not a creationist. We don't agree on probably much politically or religiously, but he thinks that there is another way to explain that. And it is kind of technical. I don't want to bore everybody with technical details, but it involves something called the global electric circuit. And there's some predictions. There are some things you would expect to happen. Basically, there's a current that comes down from the ionosphere. And I don't mean lightning. I mean fair weather atmospheric electricity. And like if you had a really sensitive device and you placed it out in the parking lot, you could measure this current coming down. And when the current passes through a cloud, it produces a layer of charge, electric charge, on the top of the cloud and on the bottom. And that charge affects how quickly these cloud droplets can scavenge up what they call cloud condensation nuclei. And so it affects the sizes of the droplets and other things like cloud lifetime. And so basically, one of the big ideas here is that when that current goes up, you get more clouds. And so anything that makes the current go up, you might see a connection where there's going to be more clouds. And so that's the idea. And I've always been suspicious about the alarmism over global warming, even before I started doing that work. I mean, as a Christian, when the entire world tells you that you better believe this and you're a horrible person if you don't, that kind of makes red flags go off in your head. It's like there's something fishy about this. But a lot of the panic on this issue is tied to a belief in evolution in an old earth. And I will tell you this, the real issue is not whether it's getting warmer. That's not the real issue. And people on both sides of the debate will tell you the real issue is something called equilibrium climate sensitivity, okay? In other words, everybody pretty much agrees that if you were to double the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the temperature is going to go up a little bit, 1 or 2 degrees. Okay. The question is what happens after that, because when you change something in the climate system, that changes something else, which changes something else, which changes something else, and so it's hard to know what the end result will be. And some people think our climate's unstable and that you're going to get this runaway temperature effect where the temperature just goes out of control. The people who aren't as worried are saying, no, the climate is not unstable. When there's a change, there are going to be these forces that bring it back into equilibrium so it doesn't get too far out of whack. And I can tell you that the main arguments for having an unstable climate are coming from computer models. And those models really aren't sophisticated enough. They're too simplistic, and they've almost always overpredicted the amount of warming in the past. But the other argument for an unstable climate is the Milankovitch ice age theory, where they're claiming that there's these subtle changes in the Earth's orbital and rotational motions over tens of thousands of years. That changes the way the sunlight falls on the Earth, and that's supposed to trigger ice ages. Well, the problem for them is those changes in sunlight are very tiny, and it's hard to see how they alone could cause you to go into an ice age or come out of an ice age. But because of their belief in long ages, they believe that's happened 50 times in the last 2.5 million years. So if you believe that, you have to believe the climate's unstable. If little bitty changes in sunlight can trigger an ice age, then yeah, the climate's unstable. And we ought to be worried that we're going to cause something to go haywire. But what I found out, and this is why the work we're doing at ICR is so important, I found out that the argument they use for this Milankovitch theory, the number one argument, is based on an age assignment that the evolutionists no longer accept as valid. Okay, there was an age assignment that they claimed back in 1976, it was 700,000 years. Now, I don't accept that number, but that's what they said. Well, they since changed that number to 780,000 years, which may not sound like a lot, but it invalidates the original results. And so that's a big deal, because that's one of the main arguments for thinking that our climate's unstable. And it ties back to a worldview, what we believe. What you believe about Earth history influences what you believe about the present and the future. And this is a good example of that. And this is another good example of how what you believe about creation, there's practical consequences, not just theological consequences, but practical consequences. And I can tell you that most of the Christians who get worked up on this issue, almost always they believe in evolution in millions of years. Now, not every evolutionist is worried about climate change, but pretty much everybody who's worried about climate change is an evolutionist. And there's a connection between those things, yeah.
Well, that's why probably one of your seminars, I was just like looking through some of your seminars, is like understanding biblical creation, why you should believe in little Genesis.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, there's so many other things that start affecting.
Yeah.
Well, one of it is like climate change, but what else? If you don't believe in a little Genesis, book of Genesis.
Well, I mean, it's theologically destructive. I mean, you undermine our theology. Christian faith doesn't make sense apart from a literal Genesis. And one thing I like to point out to people, there's a lot of Christians out there who they deep down, they're not comfortable with evolution. And they don't like trying to add it to the Bible, but they feel like they have to because the scientists are telling them that. And so they know, hey, this is not good hermeneutics. This is really kind of cheating. But what they tell themselves is, well, once I get past Genesis chapter 2, I'm going to use good hermeneutics and no more compromises. And that's how they comfort themselves. But let me show you why that doesn't work. It immediately spills into Genesis chapter 3. Because Genesis chapter 3 is where you have the promise that God would send the seed of the woman to crush the head of the serpent. And that same chapter tells us that thorns and thistles were punishment for man's sin. Well, you know what? If you accept millions of years, the evolutionists claim thorns and thistles were here millions of years before people. So that means if you accept the millions of years, thorns and thistles can't really be the punishment for sin. And that means that's casting doubt on the promise that the Redeemer would come. And that's just Genesis chapter 3. And so when you make those compromises with evolution in millions of years, they quickly spill over into the rest of the Bible.
Absolutely. And
there's no need for it. I mean, the evidence for creation has never been stronger. It never has. Now, we're not very popular. As we get closer to the end, I'm not surprised that creation may not be popular. But when it comes to the evidence, we are blowing the evolutionists away.
Wow, that's really helpful. Yeah, because I agree completely. Like, if you stop believing chapter 1 and 2, the entire Bible, because it's constantly there, constantly references to the creation.
Yeah, it quickly unravels. And I'm sorry to say, there are professing evangelical Christians out there who will tell you that Adam was not a real person. Now, what does that do to Paul's argument for the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about the first Adam and the last Adam, if the first Adam is mythical? Absolutely. You got a problem.
You got a huge problem. Well, thank you so much for doing that. Well, we have quite a few kids actually around here, and younger. And I know that in schools we have constantly hear that like dinosaurs are just like mythical creatures, they never existed, or for and you can prove them, and that's why a lot of people around actually they accept dinosaurs as like those mythical creatures who never existed. And I know that one of your seminars is dinosaurs and the Christians.
Right. Well, okay, I think some of the people who may be saying that dinosaurs never existed, they might be Bible-believing Christians, but they don't know how to fit dinosaurs in, so they just say, well, they weren't real. Yeah. Okay, that's not the best way to deal with the subject, okay, because they were real. But dinosaurs make perfect sense in light of the Bible if you just start with the Bible and recognize the evolutionists are telling you things that aren't true. So if you start with Scripture, we know God made all the land animals on day 6 of creation week. Dinosaurs are land animals. That means they were made on day 6 of creation week. That means they were there with Adam and Eve from the very beginning. So right off the bat, you see dinosaurs didn't live millions of years ago. They were here with people from the very beginning. Well, then how do we know dinosaurs existed? Well, one of the ways we know is because of the fossils. Okay, the fossils are the remains of dead things, and we find them in these rocks that are water deposited. Material drops out of water and then later hardens into rock. And even evolutionists admit this. They will admit that nearly all of the sedimentary rocks on the earth were water deposited. Now, they will try to tell you some of them were like, stuff was slowly drifting out of a lake or something like that. We don't agree with it. We think there's strong evidence it was all moving water. It was catastrophic. But and I have a funny story to tell about that. When I was an undergraduate, I wrote some evangelistic tracts, and one was Why I Believe in the Genesis Flood. And being a totally naive kid, I thought, well, I'll just walk on over to the geology department and ask a professor, what percentage of the sedimentary rocks are water deposited? Because I didn't know, and I had trouble finding that answer in the books. So I asked this geology professor, and I say, so what percentage of sedimentary rocks are water deposited? He goes, probably about 95%. And then me being completely clueless and naive, I said, well, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm writing a little essay about why I believe in the Genesis flood. He goes, well, maybe it was 90%. But the point is, they recognize these are water deposited. And so, yes, these animals are going to be killed. They're going to be buried in the flood. And that makes sense. The Bible makes sense of dinosaurs. And it even talks about dinosaurs. It doesn't use the word dinosaur because that word wasn't invented until 1841. But the Bible talks about dragons. It talks about something called Leviathan, Behemoth. By the way, when you go to dragons, you have to go to the older Bible translations because a lot of the newer translations will render it as jackals. But if you read these descriptions, a lot of them are clearly monstrous reptilian creatures. The word jackal really is not a good fit. Okay. So the point is, if you start with Scripture, it's not that hard to figure out dinosaurs. The reason we get confused about dinosaurs is because we're accepting what the evolutionists are saying and not realizing they're telling us stuff that's not true.
That's interesting. Well, but with dinosaurs, I think there's another question, why we don't have dinosaurs today? It would be so great, if they were at that point, did all of them got extinct during the flood, or what happened?
Okay, well, that's a great question. Did they go extinct in the flood? No, they didn't, because God told Noah to take on the ark representatives of all the air-breathing, land-dwelling animals. Dinosaurs fit that description, so that means Noah took dinosaurs on the ark. And he didn't have to necessarily take big dinosaurs, because you want to take kid dinosaurs, juveniles, because you want them to reproduce and have baby dinosaurs after the flood. So there's plenty of room on the ark for these dinosaurs. And I lost my train of thought. We were mentioning...
why don't have them today?
Oh, yes, that's right. Okay, this is something I love to tell kids. I tell kids, we really when we disobeyed God, we really blew it. Do you realize that if Adam had not sinned, you could have had a pet dinosaur? For real, you could have had a pet dinosaur. And, I think there's a lesson in there that when we disobey God, sometimes we miss out on good things he has for us. But the dinosaurs, they eventually went extinct, apparently. Some people claim maybe there might be a few in some jungle somewhere. But it was gradual, because you look throughout history and there's all these recollections of dragons, historical accounts, people drew pictures of them, things of that nature. So they really do make sense, but they just gradually went extinct, probably because the post-flood and post-ice age climates were not very good for them. Especially if you're a big dinosaur. There's a lot of deserts that would not be in the pre-flood world. It's going to be harder for them to get food. And also, we probably killed a bunch of them because we were scared of them. So, that's just the consequence of sin. We miss out on some of the good things God has for us.
Well, is it true that there's Loch Ness?
Well, probably not. I asked one of my coworkers about that. He says, unfortunately, every big lake has stories of monsters, and that's probably because people are just seeing stuff. So I'm not real optimistic about that. I do think it might be possible. There might still be some marine reptiles in the ocean, and maybe, just barely, maybe some dinosaurs somewhere. At least I hope so.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Well, with that, you just talked a little bit about the Ice Age. While we're talking about Genesis and the Ice Age and dinosaurs and everyone, like the flood, all that, like, well, did Earth experience an Ice Age? And if so, how many of those? Like you already mentioned a little bit that there could be like a few or maybe like.
Right.
And how do they fit into biblical history?
Okay.
What can we say there about the Ice
Well,
Age?
the Ice Age is one of the strongest parts of the creation model. We've had a really good Ice Age theory since the mid-1980s.
Okay.
And the guy who came up with it was a former meteorologist for the National Weather Service named Mike Ord. He's still active in creation research. But basically, there's just one Ice Age. There's only strong evidence for one Ice Age. If you're looking at geological evidence, and which makes, even if you believe there were these other Ice Ages, you would not expect there to be strong geological evidence for them, because each subsequent Ice Age is going to bulldoze and destroy the geological evidence for the previous Ice Age. So just from the geology, you're not going to have evidence for more than one. And so there's just one Ice Age, and the Genesis flood is what triggered it. And basically, you have very warm oceans after the flood, because we think there was a lot of seafloor spreading during the flood. The oceans got warmed up a bunch, and you got all this evaporation, puts all this moisture into the atmosphere, and you get a lot of rain, but you also get snow and ice at high latitudes and on mountaintops. And so that starts this process of ice building up after the flood. I mean, it was like a trick. I mean, the earth was primed for this right after the flood. But you also got to keep the snow and ice from melting, because in order to have an Ice Age, the ice has to have time to accumulate. And we think probably what did that was you had all these volcanic eruptions occurring during and after the flood that put all these aerosols, little droplets, tiny droplets of sulfuric acid up in the stratosphere, and they reflect sunlight. And we know we've seen big volcanic eruptions recently. Mount St. Helens wasn't big enough to do this, okay? But like Mount Pinatubo from the Philippines, there was a slight but measurable drop in northern summer hemisphere temperatures after that. And that was just one big eruption. And we think there was probably hundreds of those going off in the centuries after the Ice Age, and that's going to keep the summers cool. That keeps the snow and ice from melting, and that enables those thick ice sheets to build up. So as the oceans cooled off and the volcanic activity diminished, then the Ice Age just gradually came to an end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I think it'll be my last question.
Okay.
With the kind of Ice Age and all that, like the end of the universe and all that, can't we say that sun's temperature actually drops down? Like again, like we saying about that the force never stops. Like it kind of goes from one matter to another. Like so, sun is hot, but it gives energy.
Right.
So how long it might give energy? Like we.
Oh, okay.
And
well, we don't have to worry about it. The Lord's given it enough energy. It's not going to run out to the Lord before the Lord comes back. Okay.
So we're not expecting an Ice Age because of that.
We don't need to worry about it. There's plenty there. Yeah.
But then about the end of the universe, so we know there will not, like the Bible says, there will be no more floods,
right.
And all of this thing, like okay, if there's no flood, no Ice Age anymore. But this imploding of the universe, or maybe explosion, I don't know, like when people say like that atomic glue that keeps the atoms together, how's that gonna happen? Like, can you just give us
I'm not sure I really know. I mean, I do take, I'm premillennial. I believe there's going to be a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, and so I'm not sure I fully understand all that. But I do think it's going to be wonderful, and the Lord's going to restore all things, and it's going to be great. And the Bible even talks about in Isaiah about longevity going back up again.
Yeah.
And That's interesting. That's very interesting. So, but anyway, yeah, it's going to be wonderful. There's a lot I don't claim to fully understand it. When I was a kid in middle school, I was arrogant enough to think I could figure out the book of Revelation, and I was going to write a commentary on it. Nope, I didn't. I didn't know enough. There were times where I thought I almost had it figured out, and then I came across a verse that just blew my theory to pieces, and it didn't work. So, yeah.
Well, I know you might have significantly more questions to Dr. J. Hebert, but we would like to thank you. Thank you, Dr. J.
Thanks
Hebert.
for having me.
If you
I
can just
really
name Doctor.
appreciate it. Yes, okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.